Now, so I'm Karen Milbourne, and I'm a curator at the National Museum of African Art, joined by our web guru, Michael Briggs. And I will say that from the African Art Museum, it really was a two-person show, but this was absolutely a project that required the whole of the Smithsonian. And I would like to thank personally Dan and Nancy, because they both had direct involvement in making this possible. So this was, in fact, the first and so far only mobile application that we have produced, and it was in conjunction with the 2011 exhibition called Artist and Dialogue. The exhibition is actually part of a series of exhibitions that's targeted to a public that's used to reading and being fed information, but not necessarily looking and understanding how to think visually. So it talks about the art of communication. How do we share information, and how can that information be shared in different formats? So it was everything about it set up to think about how to communicate between two artists, how to communicate between a public and a museum, and how to keep that going and motivated. So it was made in association with an exhibition that lasted 11 months. It was never intended to be launched at the opening because we knew that we couldn't. We actively wrote grants, so I mean, this was funded through many applications to Women's Committee, to the Latino Initiatives Grant, to the now defunct Smithsonian 2.0, to the discretionary funds of my own director. It took a sort of various pots to pull things together, and we worked with Tristan Interactives, who were really wonderful in being flexible in that regard. They knew that our money was insecure, and they helped me write the grants and develop the content and put the budget together in an incredibly generous manner. That being said, then when we hit D-Day, they were trying to get their foot in the door, and they had too many essay projects going at the same time, and they actually missed all our deadlines. So one thing I would say as a note to the wise is, when we went through the contracting process, we never wrote in what happens if you don't get your deliverables, because the SI Legal said, well, then isn't the contract in breach and you don't have it anymore? And of course, we still wanted to follow through at that point. So like figuring out what they were going to do as extras to pay us back for this was something that we hadn't thought through in advance. There were other things. It really was a learning process, and I will say that we were very happy with the app itself. It is the structure of the Smithsonian, as we all know, and it's a lot of the things that people have touched on, and I'm going to bring them up too, because it was really important to me that this was created with the idea of being democratic. So how could we make it as accessible as possible? And how could we distribute it in a world where not everybody has access to this technology? And the Smithsonian was still very much in the fledgling stages of figuring that out. And this was in many cases the test case where we figured out how to get some of these devices shared and so forth. So, you know, I'm just starting with the introduction that we even had, and that's actually the real signage that was used in the museum, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. First, I just wanted to give, I don't have a lot of visuals because I'm hoping that you will download the app or play with it later. But we did have multiple tiers of information, from what you might call a more basic tour of the exhibition that was not in any way a replication of the labels. It was, again, very important that the content be different. I started with the premise that this should be device specific. So I didn't want to replicate something that you had on any other kind of platform. So I wanted to think of it as an intimate experience, something that lived outside the museum, and something that was a complement and might even be downloaded separately and draw people into the museum. So with that in mind, it had some basic information like where the museum's located, and it fed into Trumba that had other events getting promoted as well. It had, as I said, the tour of the exhibition that did include every artwork, and I'll show you more of this, but it included quotes by the artists. It included audio of the artists talking about one another's work, talking about their own work. It had my voice recorded by a Dan, thank you very much, and an opportunity to create your own work of art, and a quiz so that people could learn about the countries that the artists came from. So we've talked a lot about sort of what were the targets, and I can say that we had some very basic targets. Like I said, one was the art of communication and simply thinking visually, but also we live in a world where unfortunately a lot of people still think that Africa is a country. And so we were trying to show the specificity of the countries within, and in particular South Africa, and how African art it's not just that it should be in dialogue with the rest of the world, but that in fact it is. And so the two artists, one was Brazilian and one was South African. And so we worked actually with the embassies of South Africa and Brazil, both to develop the content and then to promote it. Okay, so this actually shows you what the interactive quiz looked like. And here I give total kudos to Tristan Interactives for finding freeware imagery to go with each and every quiz. Again, it took a lot of working through because we had to generate all the questions with the embassies and then trying to come up with a way that the questions would change so that you can play it multiple times. We didn't want it to be a one-shot wonder. So this gives you a sense of what it looks like when you're right and, what the question looks like, and then when you get the answer right or wrong, you're allowed to retry so that you can actually learn and keep playing. And the questions were on all kinds of things. From popular movies to currency to economics to you have it. It was just to sort of give information about the world. The other thing, as I said, it was very important to keep it democratic, and in order to make that possible, I forgot something that I'm going to go back to. Okay. In order to do that, we did have the quotes by the artists, and we had each of them speaking, but this, of course, required them that when we went, I wanted it to be internationally accessible, that this was taking the exhibition beyond the museum walls, and so therefore we had it also translated into Brazilian Portuguese. So it is a completely bilingual app, and this meant then that we had to hire actors to play myself and the two artists. And this, again, was a layer that we hadn't prepared for, where it was in the contract that Tristan would provide the translation, but then we didn't really have anyone in place who spoke Brazilian Portuguese to proof it and make sure that the content was being translated properly. And in the end, the artist himself did it. But that was something that he did through the generosity of his time, and was just something that we realized that you really needed to think through. And it definitely added a layer of cost. Hiring the actors, proofing that, getting the sound right, and so forth. One thing I want to go back to just for a second, because this is one of the places where my colleague here was the particular genius, and that was, as I said, this was an exhibition that was about conversation. So inside the gallery, there was a Twitter feed that was actually at accessible height. And I'm going to let Mike talk about what he did, because then that fed into this join the conversation section.
Who was working with a cold, by the way, so I apologize. So what we did was in the gallery, we made the Twitter feed, the author of it, the public. So instead of having them come in, log in as them and whatever, and then post their comment, that app, that implementation of Twitter was, the world was the author of that particular Twitter account, for lack of a better. So whenever people posted, it was always from, artists in dialogue, but at least we keep everything together and hopefully avoid any kind of problems. One interesting problem that did happen was at the time we had security guards that were on a temporary basis, and I was at my desk around 10:15 watching the feed go by, and all of a sudden I see a lot of nasty stuff appearing on the screen. So I run up to the gallery, and sure enough, this temporary guard was tweeting like a lot of nasty stuff, porn, basically, thinking he was being cute, not realizing that, what was going on, kind of a thing.
Really temporary.
So he went bye-bye, that day.
Temporary.
Yeah. So that was the only glitch we had with this. And so with the app, we tied in the same kind of feature. So, the login and everything like that was built into the app. So when you tweeted, you just tweeted. You didn't have to do anything or anything like that. So it all sort of fed together in one big Twitter feed. That was the one contribution that I brought to it.
Not the only contribution that Mike brought to it. Mike and Nancy both, I was the person who sort of was the bee in the bonnet who came up with the ideas and then has no technical skills to make any of it happen. So a lot of people, as I said, helped to make this possible. And we also did informed questions where we changed every month to 2 months the question that was out there to ask the public. But we still found that there was a lot of feedback, but it was mostly people saying things like sweet and love Bololo or what have you. It was responding to the artwork, which was what we wanted, but not necessarily engaging in dialogue. And I think that that's partly, the nature of 140 characters. You're not going to get an informed dialogue in that particular kind of a format. We also had a blog that accompanied the exhibition, and you could tap into it through this. And that, again, had video of the artist making the work and was trying to be a format. But I think the public likes to go to these things and receive information. It's not the space that they go to to play with it. So the other thing that we did that limited actually the number of platforms we could go to was it was absolutely fundamentally important to me that you have a create your own artwork element. And so we allowed people to simulate or evoke using the techniques of the artist. So one artist built with scraps of wood. You could actually take layers of pulled wood fiber and try and build a collage that way and change the colors the same way that he did. Or you could try and paint like he did, and then you could choose regular paintbrush functions. The other artist painted with fire, and so he took flaming pans and made scorch marks on a canvas, or he would use a blowtorch directly onto the canvas. So we provided those elements where you could burn your surface, if you will, with the icons. But this used old Mac art tools, and so it made it not easily transferable to PC. So we ended up with an app that is iPhone and iPad specific. People have very much enjoyed it and have really enjoyed this feature. It was commended by Mashable as one of their top picks. It's gotten other sort of accolades, more word of mouth, I would say, than actually public awards or anything like that. But the idea was that, I suppose we really did target 18 to 45 as our key audience, but this was intended to be something that anybody could play with. And as I said, something that somebody could play with outside the exhibition, having never come, still enjoy it, or come in and sit there and start to think about how hard it is to work with these different techniques. We had originally planned actually to have that function be something that would post automatically to our Facebook page, and then we could have a people's choice. That ended up not being technically easy, and so we opted not to do that. And the other thing I will say is that the exhibition, even though it did not travel and it is now down, people continue to download the application. It is still living, and I haven't looked at it recently, but I know like over the summer, just on a random Wednesday that I checked, 19 people had downloaded that day. So I find that surprising that 2 years after the show is closed, it still has this life. Yeah.
Just want to say one thing about the artwork. The problem was, well, there is a function in the app to email that image to whoever you want. So a friend, family member, a friend, yourself, whatever. The idea of pushing it directly to became really a cost issue because of all the technology underlying that action. So it wasn't as, it really was, we did the best we could with, I don't remember what the budget was, but it was a relatively small budget. Tristan was great. Tristan was a problem at times too. Tristan was like life. But overall, I think it's something that we're very proud of. I mean, wouldn't you say? I think the museum was too, so. I just want to bring that one point out. No,
it's been great. And then I would say that the main issues we actually had were practical issues that we had not thought through in advance. We had a no cell phone policy in the museum, so we had to suddenly remove the no cell phones from throughout the museum. We had to create new signage that would go up. Our signage was so tastefully designed that people did not see it. Then, it would go on the VIARC desk and people would put other things on the desk in front of it. It took us actually longer to figure out how to distribute iPod touches than it took us to go through the contracting process. And that is because we went to Smithsonian Enterprises. They did not want to be financially responsible. Originally, VIARC didn't want to because we do not have a set staff of volunteers at the museum. We had no way of figuring out how to secure the devices. So everything from getting the color picked for the lanyards that the devices would hang from, every element took months to determine. And so I will say that ultimately we did find a solution that was very helpful, where the devices were only available from 10 until 4 so that they could be checked in before the museum closed and before the staff left. The signage was up appropriately. We did have Wi-Fi on site. It was very challenging sometimes to get them the passwords for our Wi-Fi, but that was something that was made possible occasionally. But the thing that we did that was probably the most effective is we worked with the docents early on. So while the app was still in development, we took it to the docents. They were among the team who played with it. Not all of our docents embraced it. I would say 6 to 8 did, but one was particularly effective. I mean, they would go in and with every tour have a basket of iPod touches with them. They would show people how to use it. They would hold up and ask people to start tweeting in the gallery. And so that became a routine part of how the tours were given, and then people could hold on to the device for as long as they wanted afterwards, or download it themselves before taking it upstairs and turning it back in again and getting their ID back. So that was really the main challenge, is making the docents feel like they were not being overridden, making them feel an investment into this being a tool that could accompany them rather than challenge them. And then, like I said, figuring out your distribution is at least equally challenging to getting your contract in place, and that has to be figured out in advance. So that was it. Thanks.